and welcome back to the NPTEL online certification course Tribal Studies in India, Interdisciplinary Perspectives and Approaches. Today we are going to look at tribes in post-colonial India, tribal politics and political parties. I think this is a very important and very interesting topic for us to study, and particularly as you know, in India being one of the largest democratic country in the world, it is the more important to really look at to really understand the issue of tribal politics and how tribal communities have engaged with democracy in the last 70 to 75 years. Now, needless to say, the issue of politics, in a sense that have always attracted attention from political scientists, sociologists, or the larger social science fraternity. And particularly the experience of India is very important because India being a very diverse country in terms of religion, in terms of language, in terms of caste, in terms of region. So, it was not very easy, particularly at the dawn of India's independence. And many also have many observers, particularly from outside of India, were also very skeptical about whether India's democracy will survive, but it survived. And there are a lot of explanations, there are a lot of ideas, there are a lot of perspectives, and many a times Indians democracy or democracy in itself is not understood only as a form of governance. The issue of democracy has been explored from different vantage point in terms of region, in terms of its interface between caste and democracy, or in terms of gender, or in terms of women and democracy. And in that spirit, we will try to, based on through this lecture, we will try to look at how tribal communities have interacted with democracy, the kind of political participations or the kind of contributions that tribal communities have made to the larger India's democracy. And also at the same time, we will also try to look at the political trajectory or the political aspirations of tribal communities through this lecture. Now, to begin with some of the conceptual foundations pertaining to modern politics, and since we are talking about a democratic country like India, one cannot but start with the question of representation. And democracy essentially being a system of governance where we elect representatives, and we are talking about representation particularly in terms of elections or electoral system. A very important fundamental explanation was given by Grazia in 1968, which explained representation is constitutive of the representative and the represented. So, there are two parts of representation in democracy. One is the representative and one is the represented. Now, the representative holds the authority in a sense that they are the one who are being elected on behalf of the represented, and the represented or the people are the one who bestowed or who endowed power or authority to the representative. So, therefore, democracy, as its essence is about people, it is about people, whether they are literate or illiterate, whether they are young or old. If they attain for instance in the case of India, attain the age of 18 years, they have the right to cast their vote, they have the right to elect their representative. So, in that sense, the represented bestowed authority over the former, that is the representative. Now, before I proceed, this question of representation is very important, particularly in the context of India, because when India attained independence, it directly or automatically made universal adult suffrage, in a sense that anyone and everyone, irrespective of irrespective of their identity, irrespective of the kind of social backgrounds they have, irrespective of whether they are rich or poor, everyone have the right to vote. So, if you look at countries in many parts of India, even Western countries which have been championing democracy all over the world, you will see that for a long period of time, even in the United States, women were not allowed to vote, blacks were not allowed to vote. It was only very recent that women were allowed to vote, blacks were allowed to vote. But in the context of India, starting from independence, every adults who have attained the age of 18 years have the right to vote. So, therefore, the question of representation in the context of India is also very important when one talks about try to understand questions or issues pertaining to democracy. Further, representation have two strands. One is the substantive part and the other is the descriptive part. Now, in the case of the substantive representation, most of the time we are talking about issues and ideas concerning the represented, not only representative, which means that the representation of the represented is paramount, thus minimizing the significance of the representative. So, basically in terms of when we are talking about substantive representation, we are mostly talking in terms of the representative being representing who they actually are supposed to represent. So, it is more about the represented, it is more about the people rather than the elected representative, that is the substantive part. On a broader level, party ideologies along with mechanisms of accountability is what takes precedence over the individual characteristics of the elected representative, which has made substantive representation highly valued in the liberal democracy. Now, what about the descriptive representation? The descriptive representation values the representatives. Now, in the case of substantive representation, we are more focused about the people who are being represented. Now, in the case of descriptive representation, the focus or the issue or the attention is shifted towards the representative, that is the person who is representing the people. So, therefore, in that sense the individual characteristics such as race, gender, ethnicity becomes very important and very fundamental part of the representation. That is to say, the representative represents the identity of the represented. Now, in the context of the substantive representation, you are not very bothered about the individual characteristics, the markers of the representative. Now, in the descriptive representative, you are concerned or you are the individual characteristics such as race, what race he or she belongs to, what is the ethnicity, what is the religion, what is the language, all these things become an important part of the representation. So, the representative represents the identity of the represented. So, that is what essentially descriptive representation is. So, the emphasis on the representative is what makes descriptive representation a means of empowerment for the downtrodden, disadvantaged and marginalized groups for whom visibility to one of their own is fundamental. Now, in the case of descriptive representation, this becomes more pertinent particularly for underrepresented groups, particularly for marginalized sections, the downtrodden, the disadvantaged groups, essentially because many times you see that there are certain groups who are not being represented enough. So, in that kind of context, descriptive representations becomes very important. That is to say, I am reading the quote here, in the context of group mistrust, uncrystallized interests, a history suggesting inability to rule and low de facto legitimacy, descriptive representation enhances substantive representation by ensuring inclusion of disadvantaged and powerless groups, improving the quality of deliberation and would in turn ensure the empowerment of these groups, unquote. Now, this is a very important important quote that I just read out, that why is descriptive representation important in democracy? Why is descriptive representation important for a country like India also? Essentially is that it provides a possible pathway for underrepresented groups to be represented in the larger democratic framework, and which further actually improves the quality of democracy in terms of the kind of issues that are being deliberated, and which further not only enhances the true representation, but also resulted into the empowerment of the groups that are being represented. So, that is why descriptive representation is also widely practiced in many democratic countries. So, the political theorist Annie Phillips introduced the idea of politics of presence, which is based on three key beliefs. First, it argues that communities who have been historically marginalized or excluded have their own unique interests, needs and concerns that are different from those of the dominant groups in society. Second, it claims that these interests cannot be fully or fairly represented by people who do not belong to these groups. In other words, someone from outside the community may not truly understand or prioritize their issues. Third, the concept emphasizes that having people from these disadvantaged groups elected in a political position ensures that their voices are genuinely heard. Now, we are still trying to understand the logic of descriptive representation. Now, the political theorist Annie Phillips coined this idea, coined this term, that the politics of presence, by which Phillips talks about three fundamental things of the idea of the politics of presence. One is that communities who have been historically marginalized or excluded have their own unique interests, in a sense that there are a lot of marginalized communities. There are a lot of communities, for example, even in India. Not everyone have similar interests. Not everyone's problem is the same. Even within a single region, even within a single state, one can find these communities who are actually marginalized, underrepresented, they will have their own unique problem. They will have their own distinct issues, which actually may be very different even within the marginalized sections. Now, therefore, many a times what can happen is that a person from outside of the community may not be in a capacity to fully understand things from their perspectives, right. Even if representation is there, even if the community have representation in different ways, or if the community is being represented by someone else, what can potentially happen is that the representative may actually not really understand the real issues of the people. That is the kind of limitations that Annie Phillips talks about. Now, therefore, by politics of presence, Phillips also emphasized that people from these disadvantaged groups, once elected in the political positions, ensure that the kind of issues that the communities strongly feel are genuinely heard and their issues are properly addressed. Now, this is one of the reasons why that many communities in India are also demanding several kind of provisions that will allow them to represent themselves, not only be represented. As such, Phillips argued that simply changing the makeup of elected bodies by ensuring that marginalized groups are actively represented is an essential step in deepening democracy. For her, this was not just about numbers or representation, but about making democracy more inclusive, equal and responsive to all citizens. Now, not only in India, in many democratic countries, one can say that everyone has the chances to become elected, everyone is being represented equally, but many a times communities are very complex. Internal differentiation can be can happen at various levels, in terms of caste, religion, region, in terms of class, in terms of wealth, so on and so forth. In that kind of context, there are always certain groups which are underprivileged, there are groups that are marginalized. At the same time, there are groups that are dominant, there can be also groups who are quite overrepresented. Now, in that kind of context, what Phillips essentially is arguing is that by ensuring that marginalized groups are participating in the larger democratic form of governance, what we are essentially doing is that democracy is only becoming more strong, democratic institutions are becoming more durable, they are becoming more efficient. So, therefore, she calls this as we are only deepening democracy. So, now let us come to in the context of tribes. Now, you will see that tribal population in India is about 8.6% of India's total population, which probably could be around maybe 30 to 35 crores probably. So, if you look at it, the communities are also very scattered, except in northeastern part of India. In the mainland part of India, you will see that the population of tribes are very scattered. In terms of their demography, they are in some states they are very small, they are very negligible. In certain states like Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh, you will see that some form of visibility is there. But by and large, when it comes to political representation at the state level, at the national level, the representation is still very low. Even for tribal dominated states like northeastern part of India, you will see that at the state level, the representation is fairly good, because in many states like Meghalaya, Nagaland, Mizoram, tribes are demographically the dominant communities. But when it comes to the national representation again, then you will see that the kind of representation at the national level is not comparable to many other communities or many other regions. Now, we will try to specifically draw our attention to the question of representation in the context of tribal communities. Now, when one talks about representation in the tribal communities, group representation is one of the most essential feature when it comes to tribal politics in India. And this idea of group representation is guided by the belief that people sharing similar backgrounds, undergoing similar kind of experiences are in a better position to represent the community. So, basically the idea is what we have already elaborated in the case of descriptive representation, in a sense that representations from within the community is better than a community being represented by someone else. This is not to say that only tribes should represent tribes. This is not to say that only that region, that language speaker or that community should represent them. The point being that at the larger level, many a times it is better that the communities themselves find representation, or the community themselves find a representative that will represent them. Making argument in favor of group representation, the political theorist Kymlicka, for instance, says that this idea of group representation is imminent against further exclusion and marginalizations from the political processes. Now, over the last 50 to 75 years of India's independence, tribal communities, the kind of political engagement that they have with the larger mainstream politics, have undergone significant transformation, starting from the pre-colonial period, the colonial period, and the post-colonial period. Now, in the pre-colonial period, more or less they have their own autonomous set of political institutions, and there was more or less a kind of self-rule that these communities enjoy. Now, in the colonial period, you will see that although tribal communities in many parts of India were put under indirect rule, you will see that they were already integrated into the colonial state system. In the post-colonial period, these existing institutions, these existing structures of governance were being inherited by the post-colonial Indian state, and more or less it works towards the integration of tribal communities in the larger polity in India. So, the colonial period becomes very, very important, and it was the British who introduced tribal communities to electoral politics for the first time through the Government of India Act 1935, because this act gives provinces more power to govern themselves and also made special arrangements to protect the interests of certain disadvantaged communities by reserving seats in the legislative bodies. Now, the question of reservation of seats for tribal communities or for certain underprivileged or disadvantaged groups was made from the Government of India Act of 1935, which makes it very possible for us to start our narrative of understanding tribal representations from the colonial period. As a part of this, reserved seats were given to Muslims, Christians, and Europeans in the provincial legislative councils under the 5th schedule of the Act. However, scheduled castes and backward tribes were not given representation or reservation in these councils, and these communities, however, received more reserved seats in the provincial legislative assemblies. Now, in the post-independent India, it becomes very, very challenging, at least for the Constituent Assembly, to come up with a kind of framework or a solution for the tribes, essentially because many tribal communities in India were demanding autonomous governance, and also this demand was a kind of precondition that was given by the tribal communities that they will integrate with India only if they are granted some form of or promised some form of autonomy. So, this was the kind of challenges that was there at the dawn of India's independence. Political reservation. So, in response to the kind of demands and aspirations which was made by the tribal communities, political reservation was adopted for ensuring that tribal representation at the highest level of political institutions is ensured. For instance, Article 330 and 332 of the Indian constitutions provide reservation of seats in parliament and state legislative assemblies to the scheduled tribes respectively. So, the insertion of Article 330 and 332 was essentially to ensure that some seats in the parliament and some seats in the state legislative assemblies are being reserved for the scheduled tribes. So, two very important scholar Ambaguria and Professor Khaka, they note that this reservation of seats is based on the proportion of tribal population in the constituencies. This proportion is again based on the guiding principle that any successful electoral system cannot offer to ignore the underrepresentation or lack of representation of ethnically minority communities. So, therefore, again it is always about ensuring that tribal communities are also were given some form of some pathway as to so that they are capable of participating in the larger democratic process of the country. These reservations in the electoral systems was introduced, but then the idea was that this was supposed to be something that was temporary, and the main agenda was that the communities or all communities in India, including tribal communities, should have fair representation in political bodies. Now, we know that during the entire colonial period, tribal communities were being kept away, as if that they were not interested in any kind of politics, or as if they have no political consciousness, or as if modern politics were unsuitable for tribal communities. But then on the contrary, what we see is that by the time from the 1930s onwards, you will see different kind of political mobilizations that actually challenge the kind of political systems that was being instituted by the colonial state. And by post independence period, we see that tribal communities began to demand political representation, and this demand was resulted in the culmination of the 6th schedule and the 5th schedule that we have talked about in the last few classes. So, electoral reservations were part of the extension of the kind of demands and aspirations that the tribal communities made, and these reservations electoral reservations were supposed to be temporary in nature. At first, this system was supposed to last for 10 years only, based on the belief that this period would allow enough time to address the needs of these communities and measure the outcomes. However, the political reservation for scheduled tribes has been repeatedly extended over the years. So, even today in India also, you will see that some constituencies are exclusively reserved for tribal communities, and this reservation, as Amba Gudia and Khakha notes, that is based on the proportion of tribal population in the constituencies. Now, it does not mean that anywhere and everywhere reservation for tribal communities in some constituencies needs to be made, but that cannot happen. It can only happen when there is a significant proportion of tribal population in the constituencies. Now, in the northeastern part of India, it has been successfully implemented, where many constituencies such as in Meghalaya, Mizoram, some parts of Manipur, Nagaland are exclusively reserved for tribes, and non-tribals cannot contest in that kind of reserved constituencies. But in these states, again, the population is also, they are predominantly tribal communities. Now, let us try to quickly run through the electoral system in India. I am sure that all of us know the kind of electoral systems that we follow in our country. So, the electoral system in India, in a very broad sense, is divided into 3 phases. One is the one party dominance, that is from 1952 to 1967. Basically, we are talking about the dominance of the Congress, and the decline in one party dominance and successive rise of opposition parties between 1967 to 1989. And third is the multi-partisan cooperation, as no single party was able to secure majority in the national elections. Now, for almost like 15 years, we have one party dominance, that is Congress was dominant, a dominant political force, and there was more or less no opposition. But from the 1968 onwards, what we essentially see is that this one party dominance begin to show decline, and from 1990s onwards, we began to see that a lot of regional parties begin to sprout up in different parts of the country, and this resulted into multi-partisan cooperation, because there is no single party which was able to secure majority in the national elections. So, during the dominance of the Congress party, that is essentially between 1952 to 1967, this period was marked by low level of electoral participation, as Congress was the single largest party, and there was no opposition at all. So, moreover, the social identities, particularly caste of candidates, also played a very important role in turning the voter sentiments, and as such, the political scientist Yogendra Yadav argued that the trend of upper caste occupying the educational occupational positions continued in the electoral system as well. So, by and large, what we see is that there were some certain caste groups who dominated the political scene in the first phase, that is during the 1952 to 1967 period. In the second phase of electoral system, that is from 1967 to 1989, you will see the entry of the middle or the other backward classes in the electoral politics, and it was during this time that we begin to see the rise of regional parties, or the rise of caste based political parties such as the Samajwadi Party, the Janata Dal United, the RJD, so on and so forth in many parts of India, even in the southern states as well. So, the political mobilization of backward castes with state-wide caste alliances challenged the otherwise dominance of Congress in national and state elections. Now, the mushrooming of these different political parties from the 1970s onwards also means that the one party dominance or the dominance of the Congress was getting challenged, and these new political formations actually began to rule successfully, snatched power from the Congress in many parts of India. This phase was also marked with articulation of state-wise demands and grievances, which also bolstered the opposition parties to put a united front against the Congress. The prominent among them was the Janata Dal under the leadership of V. Pratap Singh. So, further the disintegration of Janata Dal gave rise to regional political parties such as Biju Janata Dal and Rashtriya Janata Dal. Post the post 1990s period saw the structural reforms in economy and simultaneously rise of the coalition governments, arguably expanding electoral choices for the voters. Now, till 1967, there was only like one choice, basically the Congress. From 67 to 90s onwards, you see the mushrooming of different political parties all across the country. In the south, you have AIA, DMK. In the northern part of India, you have SP, JDU, and these political parties also suffer from fragmentation, split because of different reasons. But the point being that the electorals, the representatives, the represented actually begin to have more choices in terms of who to vote, right. So, therefore, you see the kind of political fragmentation that is happening, which resulted into a sea of change in India's politics. Now, in terms of political representation, mostly tribal representation in the parliament and state assemblies happen mostly through the route of the mainstream political parties. While tribal members have been elected from different areas, they have often formed a strong support base for specific parties. For a long time, the community supported the mainstream political parties such as the Indian National Congress, the Bharatiya Janata Party, and some were also aligned with leftist parties. Tribal voices are also increasingly heard through regional political parties, including those formed by tribal communities themselves. For instance, the Jharkhand Party, which is also one of the party that actually emerged from within the community themselves. The first general elections after independence, they won 25 out of 35 tribal reserve seats in Bihar, in the Bihar assembly. It also won 5 general seats and 2 reserve seats for the scheduled caste, becoming the main opposition party with 32 seats. Since the disintegration of Jharkhand Party, tribal-led political parties have weakened, though in recent years there have been signs of revival, like the emergence of the Gondwana Prajatantric Party. So, you see that along with the sea of change in terms of or the changing face of India's democracy in India in the last 70 years, you see that the kind of political representations that tribes are also getting also in some sense change in response to what is happening at the larger level. So, initially tribal communities mostly align themselves with national parties like Congress, the BJP, and also some left parties. But over a period of time, because of the kind of fragmentation that we see in the larger Indian politics, what happened is that they also began to be a split within the communities in terms of their political loyalties, in terms of their political allegiance. But at the same time, it is not that all the communities always supported national parties. In certain states, in certain parts of India, there were already political formations with the establishment of political parties. Definitely, they are not national in nature, but they are quite influential in states where they are established. So, a very good example of this is the Jharkhand Party, which have successfully won 25 out of 35 tribal reserve seats in the first general elections that was held after independence. Now, today also there are a lot of new political parties that are formed by tribal communities, not only in Jharkhand or in the northeastern part of India, but also in states like Gujarat, in states like Rajasthan, or also in several states in different parts of India. So, however, in mainland parts of India, these political parties which are formed essentially to cater to the interests of the communities many times struggle to survive. But in the case of northeastern India, in some sense it is quite different because of the demographic advantage that tribal communities have, probably, for which regional political parties or tribal based political parties remain a very predominant force in many states in the region. So, this is happening despite the fact that many of these parties have also split or changed. However, even till today, if you look at the political landscape of northeastern India, you can see that many states in India are actually ruled by regional political parties. So, today in Meghalaya, we have a regional political party led by the Chief Minister Conrad Sangma. In Mizoram also, we have a regional party which is the Zoram's People Movement, led by the CM Lal Duoma. In Nagaland also, we have always seen that definitely Congress and many other political national parties are very important, but you see that it is mostly ruled by the regional political players are very important when it comes to the northeastern part of India. So, before I conclude, so what I wanted to do in this lecture is essentially to show that there are effort to also not only integrate tribal communities within the larger nation, but also integrate them within the larger political processes. And for this, the constitution in the constitution we have specific provisions that granted reservations for tribal communities, where only people with scheduled tribe backgrounds can contest election in certain reserved constituencies. Now, this is done so as to ensure that tribal communities are not fully marginalized in the democratic processes, marginalized in the sense that they have no representation. It is more or less trying to ensure that the groups also have representation at the national level, at the state level. Now, the kind of representation that tribal communities have also is not the same, essentially because many tribal communities in India are very few in numbers, whether they are in the southern part of India, whether in the northern part of it, or even in northeastern part of India. Even if I say that tribal communities are dominant in many states in the northeastern part of India, if you just look at if you look at the inside of these states, you will see that these are very heterogeneous states where you have a lot of tribal communities. Now, there are some communities whose populations are quite strong, by which by virtue of which they are also politically very dominant, but there are some communities which are very small in terms of their demography, by which they have no political representation. So, it is a very complex terrain which one has to carefully analyze. But at the same time, at the broader level, what we see is that efforts have been made to ensure that political participations of these communities are being ensured, and they also contribute significantly to the democratic process. So, I am going to stop here. In the next class, what we will do is that we will continue with this lecture in terms of trying to understand tribal communities, tribal politics, and we will also do a case study from which we will be able to have a more proper understanding or a more in-depth understanding of how tribes have engaged with India's democracy in the last 70 to 75 years. Thank you so much.